you looking for clever methods to address complex problems? Do you need ways to make predictions, determine probability, or minimize risks? If you do, then you're in the right place. Welcome to our podcast that we call Smart Remarks, Howarth States. Now here are your hosts, Christian Smart and Doug Howarth.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to Smart Remarks, Howarth States. I'm Doug Howarth, and with me today is my co-host, Dr. Christian Smart. Christian, how are you today?
Oh, doing well. How are you, Doug?
Great. Christian's got his book proudly displayed behind him there. He just gave a course on it just this week. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your course there, Christian?
So I developed a one-day course based around my book. It goes over the ideas in the book. It also goes a little more detail into hands-on and provides some simple examples of how to do risk in Microsoft Excel without using simulation, and how to do it in Microsoft Project, qualitatively. You can add little smiley faces and frowny faces in Project depends on how your risks are going for individual schedule elements, and also some calibration tools that I discuss in my book, go over that and things like that. So, and also a joint confidence level analysis calculator you can do parametrically quickly versus integrated cost and schedule risk analysis from the bottom up, which can take days and weeks to put together.
Interesting. Great. Well, so your book, tell the people again where we can find your book.
You can find it on Amazon. It's currently under the retail list price is $60, but you can find it on Amazon for under $40 now, both in the hardcover and an ebook version. It's also available at Barnes & Noble and some stores as well as online. And there's other outlets it's available through as well, but those are two of the prominent ones.
Well, Christian, I know you and I do a lot of reading about people that are in our field, and you made an interesting discovery this week about, how should we say it, somebody that didn't get their ideas exactly right. In fact, one of the themes for this podcast is getting things right. And why don't you explain to me what you told me earlier in the week that I found particularly disturbing, and you did too. In fact, you ran a post on it off your blog, right?
On a blog, yeah, Smart Remarks. So I'm a practitioner of risk analysis. I've written about it, but I'm also a student. I'm continuing to learn. As Michelangelo said at age 87, I'm still learning new things, and so I try to always continue to learn. Not nearly that old, but I continue to learn new things. So I was reading a book on some issues and some failures and frauds and screw-ups in acquisition called bad buying. And it starts off with a really interesting story. And once I had saw that, or I guess I was listening to audio versions of, once I heard that story, I thought, oh man, I wish I had heard this before. I could include this in my book. That's a really catchy story. It really relates to risk. And it basically goes like this. So NASA spent millions of dollars and spent years developing a space pen of their own money. NASA spent basically taxpayer dollars. And because, if you're in microgravity, it's hard to use a pen because basically the way that the ink flows to the tip of the pen is through gravity, but there's very low gravity in space. So they developed a pen that would basically push use a gas cartridge that would push the ink towards the tip of the pen and allow it to work in space. And this worked really well. And the American astronaut was bragging to one of his Russian cosmonaut colleagues that, hey, look at this nice space pen that NASA has. And he said, oh, that's great. We use pencils. It's a nifty story in the sense of, hey, there's the government spending money on things that don't need,
right,
spending too much. Why not just use a simple solution like a pen? So I thought it was a really neat story, but I thought, well, I wonder if that's really true. So I did a little research the other day and found out that it really was an urban legend. It's an urban legend. NASA did not spend millions of dollars developing a space pen. In the early days in space, they actually, both the Russians and the NASA astronauts used pencils, but there are some problems with pencils. So that basically, you're writing with a pencil, the tip can break off. Well, that's not a big deal on Earth, but if you're in microgravity, then you have a small graphite or lead tip floating around, and it could hit you in the eye or cause other damage. So that's not good. You have debris. Also, one of the concerns that NASA had was that the material is flammable. They had the Apollo 1 fire because of a pure oxygen environment, and they were concerned about the materials. The materials are flammable. It's not necessarily a big risk, but there was a concern about that. So they went out in the Gemini program, and they went out and they um, contracted with a company in Houston to build them some mechanical pencils that would work in space. And they spent the equivalent of what is now $1,500 per pencil. That's a lot of money on a pencil. So there was actually some public outcry about that, and that's, well, maybe we should try to find a cheaper solution. Russia, meanwhile, had switched to using grease pencils on plastic slates. So that gets around the pencil problem. But a company called the Fisher Pen Company, they spent $1 million of their own money developing a space pen with the idea, hey, maybe we could market this to NASA, and this would be also a way to get publicity. And so they developed a space pen. They spent, in internal research and development, $1 million. Developed a pen that would work in space, also would ride underwater in extreme heat, extreme cold. So potentially an astronaut can potentially use it in, outside a space capsule. And so they marketed it to NASA. NASA was a little leery because of their previous experience with the mechanical pencil, but they got them for basically what the equivalent of today is between $20 and $25 a pen. So that's not so bad, especially compared to the $1,500 mechanical pencil. So that was in the late 60s. They started using the Apollo program, and they've been using it ever since. The Russians also adopted it, and the Russians have also. So the space pen has been used by NASA and by Russia since the late 60s.
But getting back to the book and the author, so the author basically fabricated or passed on an urban legend to sell books, right?
Yes, unfortunately. I mean, I, as an author myself, I know it's hard to get everything right in a book, but I did try to, and I know you do this too. And when you write things, you try to get your references straight,
sure,
and make sure you have your facts right and document everything. I have a hard copy, I guess a paperback copy of the same book, and I was looking at it, and there's no reference to the story. There's no citation or anything. So, I try to find references and include citations like that. It's very disappointing. I've seen that, and actually the last 3 nonfiction books I've read have all had this issue.
Wow.
Personally.
Well, an important book I read for my research, and I'm trying to get my book published. I've had some interest, but as you know, it isn't published yet. But my book's on trying to figure out where things are in economic space. And so a friend of mine got me interested in the book called Longitude, excuse me. And this book is about the quest to get a device that would work at sea to keep time so that sailors could help figure out where they were in the world. And one of the events that set this in motion was something called the Scilly, with a C, Scilly, the Scilly naval disaster of 1707. And in that, on the 22nd of October that year, Sir Admiral Cloudesley Shovel led a fleet of several ships to the western end of the English Channel. And in the proverbial dark and stormy night, when you can't see the stars to get your astrolabe to get a latitude heading that might be worthwhile, and with a bunch of broken compasses, the admiral decided to set sail east, trying to go into the channel. Now, the channel, of course, is dozens of miles wide at its western extent. But he ended up on the rocks and crashed his ship, and 3 others, took 1,400 to 1,800 sailors down to the bottom of the sea. And so there was a myth there that a sailor on the flagship tried to warn the admiral that the fleet was off course, and that the admiral had him hanged by the yardarm for trying to start a mutiny. And this started the Scilly Isles in the just a few years after it happened. And then it became a kind of a growing myth, but it was never validated. And in fact, British naval historians repeatedly discredited the story. But then it was revived in one of the books that set me off on this quest to figure out what was going on in terms of trying to figure out where you are, when the author Deva Sobel presented it as an unqualified truth in her book called Longitude. So in other words, she knew it wasn't true, but it made a good story, so she passed the story on. Now I take particular exception to that. I mean, there's lots of things you could say that would make a better story, but I think it's really important, especially you and in your position trying to talk about risk. Why would you enter another risk element when you don't have to, right?
Right.
Or try to pump it up. I mean, the one thing that NASA doesn't need to do is to ignore, in this case, ignore a risk that exists, which is, pencils. Pencils are a risk.
Yes.
And so portraying it as something that isn't a risk is bad behavior in my book. So so you've seen it in some other places too. Where else have you seen it recently? Can you recall?
So there's another book called Radical Uncertainty, came out last year. Had written by two economists, John Kay and Mervyn King, who've written several books. So I was even more disappointed because I'd never read either of their work before this work. The problem with this, I'm not a fan of this book, but it had some interesting things about economic history in it, and about a 450, 500-page book. So there's a lot of things that are in there, but they play fast and loose with the facts as well. And so, for example, they are both British, so they may not. Maybe I'm faulting them too much for their lack of knowledge of American geography, but at least checked it. So they talk about the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States that was joined in Promontory, Utah, and they nailed in what they call the Golden Spike. And so there's a Golden Spike monument in a park there. And I've actually been there in the late 90s, went out there with work. And went out that way with work and happened to do a little bit, had some time to do a little sightseeing, and we drove out there with some colleagues that I was working with. And it's on a, what they call a high area, like 44,000 feet above sea level, but it's not in the Rockies. In the book, they say that the Transcontinental Spike, the Golden Spike, was driven into the ground where the rail line surmounts the Rockies. Well, it's actually west of the Rockies. The railroad crosses the Rockies in Wyoming, which is just east of Utah. So it's just a small thing, but it's just kind of just sets your teeth on edge with with it being wrong about that.
Well, if you can get your geography wrong by several hundred miles, what else did they get wrong? That's the question you got to ask yourself, right? I mean,
there's quite a few things that I took issue with. Just not only just with their approach to risk. They're academic economists to a large extent. I think one of them worked in the Treasury, but they had this approach to uncertainty, which says, well, we shouldn't be trying to measure most uncertainty. And even to the extent, which is a little bit ridiculous, they even say you shouldn't try to do, quantitative analysis in your retirement planning. Wow. Which is pretty crazy. I mean, I agree that they make a good point that, we can't really know what the stock market level will be 30 years from now. Right. We don't know what interest rates will be, those kinds of things. But to not try to take into account any sorts of planning in your retirement using some quantitative analysis would be kind of silly, and we've all benefited from doing some of that analysis, or at least working with financial advisors who do that kind of analysis and recommend different mixes of stocks and bonds based on that. So they also mention a lot of things that said that you couldn't really see this coming, which absolutely you could see it coming. And this is one that you and I have talked about in the past, is the Boeing 737 Air Max. They said, we couldn't see this coming. Yes, you couldn't see it coming because they tried to force the schedule to be shorter than it should have. They tried to go cheap, and they cut down on testing. So it's actually, yes, you could have predicted it it's been very likely. It'd been a miracle if they hadn't had significant technical issues, given the fact that they tried to cut corners on cost and they tried to force the schedule to be short. So, things like that. And when they talk about extreme events, there's actually there's a branch of statistics that's well developed called extreme value theory, and they seem to be completely ignorant of that branch of statistics when it comes to measuring the likelihood of extreme events occurring.
Yeah, and you have a COVID outbreak, that's an extreme event, or you have a tsunami in the Pacific, that's an extreme event. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to have some sort of accounting that we just don't make any measure for sometimes. That's kind of the whole point of your book, right? I mean, there are what you call fat tails in the distribution, right?
Right. Yes, and it doesn't mean we can't measure it. We should still try to measure it. And there are some things you can't measure, but they've ground ruled out most things in the real world is you cannot really apply quantitative measures, and I think that's just very wrong-headed.
Yeah, well, that's I think that's at the root of a lot of our economic problems. And you and I have been talking too about trying to apply some of the mathematical methods that you and I have,
Mhm.
and others are using right now for football, for example. So
Right.
I remember seeing Bill Belichick. I remember it was Belichick. I believe his team was down by or up by 4 with just something less than a minute to a minute and a half left in the game, and he's on his own goal line, and he's got to punt. Now, so since he's on his goal line, that means the punter is going to be on the end line, very close to it. And so if you were to punt from there and get a decent punt, say 45, 50 yards, and there's no return at all, the opponent would be at midfield. And Belichick figured 2 things out. He says, well, look, time's an issue here, and they've got to score a touchdown to beat me. Field goal doesn't no good. A field goal doesn't no good if I take a safety right here. So he decides to snap the ball to the punter, have the punter run around in the end zone until somebody comes and tackles him. So he peels off a bunch of time on the clock. So instead of punting from the end line, now he's punting up at the 20 with nobody possibly in his face. So he's gained nearly 30 yards of field position, taking a few seconds off the clock, and the outcome relative to the other team is still the same. They've got to win. They have to score a touchdown to win, whatever the point differential was. I think he might have been up by, I forgot the exact point differential, but it turned out that a field goal wouldn't beat him. So the whole idea was that you're just going to push the people back down the field. And so that's an example of right-headed thinking when it comes to the football statistics. I saw some other apparently wrong-headed things when somebody, I think they had I forgot which team it was. I think it might have been Baltimore, at 4th and 1, and the team that they were playing was driving up and down the field. And if they got the first down, they probably could have scored a touchdown and maybe had a chance to go ahead and win the game. But instead, they chose to punt, and then they lost. So, what's some of your thoughts in modern day football when it comes to some of the analysis that you do?
Yeah, so going for 2, it seems like it's a pretty risky thing to do. I think unless you have and you shouldn't always do it based on the expected values, because expected values on average, you may wind up better, but in the close game, it may wind up costing you a game. Your chances of getting a PAT are, very high.
Right.
Of going for 1 after a touchdown, you get that extra point. Probably 90. In pros, it's probably 99% plus, and college probably, depending on your kicker, probably at least 95% chance of getting that. But going for 2 is much lower, and so I've just seen time and again in recent years when aggressive college coaches go for 2 when they should have gone for 1, and they could have, and they'll go for 2, and they would win if they get it, but if they go for 1, then they go to overtime, and it seems like they would be better served, and have a better chance of winning if they went for 1 and went to overtime versus going for 2 and looking pretty bad. That's one that seems to jump out as going for 2 in close games. Seems to be counterproductive. Punting seems to be another one. Punting on 4th down, depending on where you're at on the field. And there are some coaches. I know that Lane Kiffin, who's now at Ole Miss, has a chart, and so if he's more than so far down the field and it's within 4th down and 3, he'll always go for it, something like that. He's got a chart that it's based on the analytics of how well you are likely to do, and what your increase in expected points is in terms of going for it versus punting. So using the analytics in football. Football is one of the last sports to kind of be a holdout. I think even soccer, what they call football in England and Europe, is even adopting it. But I think American football is probably a laggard in adopting analytics in its decision making.
Yeah, I think a lot of people poo-poo it, and for reasons I guess only relate back to the history of the game, that they've never. We've never had it before. We don't need it now. But at a certain point, you do need that. I mean, if you're going to punt at your opponent's 37-yard line because you can't kick a 55-yard field goal, and you've got 4th and 2, well, there's a certain chance you're going to make it at 4th and 2.
Mm-hmm.
But the chance of you punting and having roll into the end zone for a touchback is pretty high, and then you've only gained, just a few yards of field position, 17 yards of field position. Is that enough to guarantee that you, on average, would make more points in the game? I don't think so. I think that's kind of what the analytics are getting to right now. So.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that is kind of, but I just don't know. And in terms of pro football, they make a lot of sort of head scratching decisions, not only in terms of the decisions they make day to day and during the game, but also the people they select in the draft. Sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And there's something they'd be better served with using some analytics, but they seem to be making money regardless. So I don't know. Maybe they don't have as much of incentive. There are 32 NFL teams spread all over the country, but there are each one has its own market. So if you're in Chicago, you're probably going to watch the Bears. Maybe you might watch the Lions, but the Lions seem to never really have a good team. But you're going to watch the Bears, and if you look at the money that the owners of the Bears have made over the years, they've made a tremendous amount of profits, even though the team's been fairly mediocre over the last 35 years since they won a Super Bowl. So maybe there's just not a big incentive for them to. They're going to make money regardless. So maybe there's not a big incentive for them to make better decisions and use analytics.
That's an interesting point, because they've got what they call the salary cap, and what that does is it kind of forces all the boundaries of all the teams are very tightly controlled in terms of how much they can spend, and so there's the tendency for the talent to kind of regress to the mean across the league, I think, which is to say that it's very rare that you're going to see in a salary cap era somebody like the Patriots, exhibit that kind of dominance for nearly 2 decades, I think. And I think the salary cap's got a whole bunch to do with it. And when you talk about draft decisions, one of the things that we were looking at last year, remember I showed you some of that stuff that the wide receiver payment was a function of the guy's draft round and also his speed. And it turned out that speed, I think you were pointing out Jerry Jeudy from Alabama, who was relative to his teammate. Jerry Jeudy was faster, but his teammate had more receptions, right? Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Jerry Jeudy was the Blitnikoff Award winner the year prior, but he was not as fast as his teammate Henry Ruggs. So Jerry Jeudy was considered by many to be a higher rated prospect than Henry Ruggs, but Henry Ruggs was taken before Jerry Jeudy because he was the fastest wide receiver in the draft. He was the top wide receiver, I think, taken in the draft.
Yeah, so there's the perceived value of being able to catch the ball versus being able to outrun everybody there, right?
Yes. So yeah, Jeudy was a more polished runner, but Henry Ruggs was taken a few spots higher in the draft because he was faster. He was clocked. They put GPS receivers on players now, and they can track how fast they go. And I think during the Tennessee game of his last year in college, Henry Ruggs was tracked at running more than 25 miles an hour. And so one touchdown pass that he caught was he did a jet sweep in front of the quarterback. Quarterback just sort of tossing the ball just front, and then he ran around the defense and ran through and around the defense and scored a touchdown. So
the 25 amazing. Miles an hour with pads on.
Yeah.
On grass.
Cleats.
I think Usain Bolt only hits 28 miles an hour with cleats and tartan track and nothing on it. So
right, yeah.
And put that in perspective, if you could run 20 miles an hour, you would cover you cover the quarter mile in 45 seconds. I think that works out to.
Wow, that's crazy, yeah.
So a 45-second quarter is a world-class quarter. So that's at 20 miles an hour. So if you're running 25% 25% faster than that. Geez, that's just astonishing to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it seems like there are some decisions that are made in draft picks that do align with, statistics like you found
Right.
with wide receivers. The average career expectancy of a running back is only 3 years. So you don't typically see running backs taken in the first round, or they may be taken at the bottom of the first round.
Right.
So you often see that. So and that's a function of these running backs don't tend to last very long anyway. So why pay them a very large amount of money, guaranteed, if they're only going to play 3 years? So and you kind of see that. I mean, I think Leonard Fournette was taken very high in the first round, and when he was drafted, and his career is pretty much relatively defunct. He hasn't really done much lately due to injuries and other things.
Yeah, I was thinking of the fat tail analysis getting to running backs when I was watching Frank Gore make it through another season. I think he's
Mm-hmm.
the world's oldest running back right now. What is he, 37?
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, he's very durable guy, and that's the other thing I did notice about. So Derrick Henry has translated his skills well in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
He's 2 years in a row he's won the NFL rushing title, and he joined the 2000 club this year.
Right.
He played for Alabama, and one thing that I noticed about him in Alabama was that the more he played and the more carries he had, the better he did. And so it's almost like he was a function of the more he got the ball, the better he did. So in my mind, I would figure that he would be a very doable running back. And he's just 5 years in, but he's been better than average in terms of career
it's astonishing to me when somebody can last in a position where, like as you said, if 3 is the mean, and Frank Gore's out there at 15 or 16 years, whatever he's been. I mean, that's way down the fat tail, isn't it?
That's phenomenal. Yeah, it's phenomenal. I mean, because you're talking about someone that basically gets hit very hard every time unless they run untouched in the end zone.
Right.
So almost every time they pick up the ball and they touch the ball, they're going to wind up getting hit very hard. And a lot of those hits are to the head too. There's no targeting penalty on tackling a running back.
Right.
So, so they do, and you can see that sometimes with running backs that are used very heavily in college. There's an Auburn running back, Trey Mason, that finished. I think he was the Heisman finalist in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't last very long in the NFL. Part of it was because he had taken so many hits to the head.
Oh boy, yeah. Yeah, you ever been knocked unconscious?
No, you have though, right? I've
been knocked unconscious three or four times. When I was a little kid, I fell down the steps, and in the middle of a snowstorm in Wisconsin, I fell down the steps and was out for several hours. And they told me that despite there being a blizzard, they actually had to bring the plow out for me if I didn't wake up pretty soon. So that happened. And then I was knocked out playing football. I was out on my feet once. I actually went I was playing both ways for the team, and I found myself wandering into the opposing huddle. That was that was funny. And I got knocked out. I took boxing in college, and I got knocked out a couple of times. So I would have been in the protocol at least twice, maybe 4 times, depending on how bad these concussions were. But yeah, that's no fun. And somebody like Gore has probably been hit in the head hundreds of times more than I was. So interestingly, one of the things I learned in boxing class was that the average human has got an eighth of an inch of skin over their temple. That's one of the reasons that knockout punches to the temple often drop people. Mm-hmm. But that was back when Marvin Hagler was a big boxer, and we were told that his skin was 3/4 of an inch at the temple. I don't know how they managed to measure that, but they estimated his skin was 5 or 6 times the thickness of the average person. So maybe some people are just built to take punishment. I don't know.
Maybe so. Yeah. I used to play tennis with a retired NICU physician, neonatal intensive care
mm-hmm.
unit physician, and she had told me about that it's not just the concussive hits; it's also the subconcussive hits over time add up to the trauma to the brain. But there was a famous example of a football playing mathematician. I don't know if you've heard of him. He played football at Penn State. And in his 5 years of eligibility at Penn State, by the time he finished, he had a master's degree in math.
Wow.
And he got drafted as an offensive lineman for the Ravens. Played for the Ravens for a little while, and in his spare time was working on his PhD in math at MIT.
Wow.
And after he got a concussion, and I guess it's not as quite as common for offensive linemen to get concussions because they're pretty tall and their tackles are a little different. But he got concussion in practice, and he was not able to do mathematics for 2 or 3 weeks. So he decided to retire and go to graduate school full time.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it's a delicate instrument, your brain. So.
Delicate instrument. Yeah. My PhD advisor had a stroke several years ago, and after his stroke, his speech was not really impaired, but he could not do mathematics.
Oh my. Jeez.
And it really bothered him. He then had another stroke and passed away, but I did see him in between times, a couple of months period in there. I did see him in between. It was really bothering him that he was not able to do mathematics because of that. It damaged that area of the brain where he processes mathematics.
That's terrible. So, getting back to, getting it right, one of the themes that we have for today's conversation is that, modern techniques let us, and this is the problem you were talking about with Boeing. Boeing could have, had they spent the requisite time testing, they could have very likely stopped all these failures that they had with respect to the MAX program. And we have many more ways to simulate what can happen in a real world environment. But getting back to some place that I had in my youth, I used to live in Tacoma, Washington. And before we moved to the city, they had a bridge that spanned what they call the Tacoma Narrows. And that bridge, when it was first built, they found that because it had a surface area that was relatively flat and it had a bunch of very few open spaces. It was just basically a flat sheet that was presented to the wind. It would develop harmonics in the wind. And some of the people that used to drive over it, because I used to talk to people that drove over it before it had this little problem, it would actually create waves so big that you would be driving along, and if you were on the upslope of one wave and there was a car in front of you that got on the downslope, you would actually lose sight of the car in front of you because there would be a wave formed on a road deck. Well, this bridge eventually went down. It was known as Galloping Gertie. And I mean, we still have bridge failures right and left. And one of the great benefits to what it is that you're doing right now is that I think our infrastructure grade as a nation is somewhere in the D range.
Yes, absolutely.
And so it'd be interesting for me to understand how we're going to approach infrastructure upgrades in a systematic way across the country. What we do now is, I'm sure you're aware, is that, like the span of the, the I-90 or the I-80 bridge that goes across Minneapolis, the span just buckled and fell into the water and killed a few people, and then they had to rebuild the bridge. But there should have been a way to prevent that. The Interstate 95, the one that goes through from Maine down to Florida, in Connecticut, they had a bridge that went down in the 90s. And they just weren't paying attention. So how would you suppose that we could take some of the stuff that you've learned managing risk and apply it to the infrastructure problem that we have right now? I mean, it's so massive. I mean, you'd have to pick a spot to move forward, but maybe that spot is again, it would be back to some of the basics that you teach. What's the worst that could happen from a disaster on a highly trafficked bridge? What's the worst that could happen from
Look at some of the big bridges, the long bridges, and especially in highly populated areas. So I would probably start with New York, California. Look at those areas, do some assessment on what the risk is, and and determine what the develop a list of priorities and start doing some work. That could be something that with a new presidential administration, something to help kickstart the economy.
Right.
Invest in some infrastructure projects, right? Because we're still employment's still below pre 2016 levels.
Well, the way I see it is I would like to see the new president have a program kind of like FDR's, where you would have what amounts to a new civil conservation corps.
Right.
You could have people that know the skills that are working on it, people that would teach the skills to new people coming in, and then the people that are learning in the classroom, and then you could have another group that's taking care of the kids, these people that have children at the same time. You could have these people rotating about so that the thing could be self-sustaining.
Right.
And the economy could be boosted by the infrastructure, and the infrastructure could prevent massive problems happening like we've seen in the very recent past. So I'm be very interested to see somebody approach you about that.
That'd be very worthwhile project to do.
Yes. I don't know where you start because you got so many problems with COVID now, and
a lot of problems with COVID. But the numbers are trending downward.
Yes.
I did see that. I don't know how the vaccine rollout's going in California, but I did see that overall that there were more people vaccinated than confirmed new cases reported for the first time.
Wow. Well, we're having a problem getting the vaccines rolled out here, which I find distressing because as soon as you saw you had a problem, in addition to trying to prevent the disease from spreading, doing the measures you could do with masking up and distancing and the like, I think the other thing that they should have planned for is, what are you going to do when you get the vaccine?
Right.
And that was not well discussed or well thought out here. And so we're having a problem getting the vaccines to people. How are you doing? What are you doing in your state right now to get the vaccines to people?
So Tennessee is actually going out relatively well. There is they've got a priority list, 1A and 1B. 1A is healthcare workers. Mm-hmm. 1B is people over 75. Mm-hmm. And so I know, for example, our son's pediatrician, he's already gotten both his shots. He's already vaccinated. One of our friends who's 79, he just got his first shot. He's got his schedule. His second shot is scheduled for February 9th. It's a drive up. You basically drive up. Mm-hmm. You let them know that you're there. You wait. So you have to sign up in advance on Eventbrite, and it's based on, you have to have these. They know who you are basically in terms of the state. So sure. Basically, as long as you fit the criteria, you can sign up. You sign up on like an Eventbrite type of page where you sign up to take cookies to kids' schools and stuff. Sure. It's on the Eventbrite page. You sign up on there. They contact you, tell you to come, and then as you drive up in your car, you roll up your sleeve in the car, and they give you the shot in the car, and then you drive off.
Wow!
And it's a pretty quick, relatively quick. I think one friend of ours who's 79, he just got his shot recently, and he drove up, and then it's about 15 minutes before they came out to the car and gave him the shot. So
no, that's not bad at all.
Yeah. So another friend of ours lives in South Carolina. She's an athletic trainer, but as her work involves sort of physical therapy type thing, she's gotten both of her shots, and she's doing some part-time work in a clinic to help give out the shots, and she's getting trained to give the shots, even though she's not a medical professional. She, just jab somebody in the arm basically, and so she's getting some training on how to do the shots. She's going to start giving the shots. So Tennessee is actually going fairly well. Alabama is kind of near the bottom of the nation. They're a little bit slower about getting it rolled out, but I know I have some friends in Alabama that have already got at least their first shot. So
well, that's good. We're having problems here. This state has not managed to work out a way to get the vaccine distributed very well. We'll have what they call, I guess, for lack of a better term, super centers. So they'll have Dodger Stadium or the Angel Stadium down in Orange County set up for people to get the shot. And you have to have an appointment to come in, but you'll have lines that'll be literally miles long. And getting the vaccine, once you've been authorized to get the vaccine, can take hours. So they're having a real problem trying to match up with the people to the vaccines right now. So
they've set up. There's a large insurance center nearby, and that has basically been more or less abandoned because of COVID. Everybody's working remotely, and there's no plans for them to ever go back on site to work in the office. Wow. So they're using that as a place as a vaccine center. That's where people drive up to go get their shots, and they're using those medical professionals using those offices as a place to set up and give the vaccines out. They also have used a school when school was not in session over the Christmas break. But yeah, this it's pretty well set up now. Of course, we're just not as highly populated area, but at some places in California, so that may also, California having such a large population may make the problem more difficult, more challenging too.
Yeah, I'm sure the size of the population's got is one of the variables there, but it's disappointing. We were hoping to be able to take a trip in June. Now they're saying first they were saying February for people my age, and my wife's a teacher, so she would have gotten the shot at the same time. And now they're saying May, June. We're hopeful that they'll be able to reel it back in a bit.
Yeah, I know that people over 60, so here it's 75, but then people over 65 in Florida and Texas are able to sign up and get the shot. My wife's aunt in Texas, who's 66, she's already signed up to get her shots. And Joe Hammaker, Joe Hammaker,
I know Joe, yeah.
Lives in Florida. He's early 70s. I think he was getting his first shot today.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, as we get more shots, then as the population gets more protected, and ought to start to turn off at the top of the curve. You're saying you're already turning off the top in Tennessee, right?
All the regions, yeah. Tennessee is already, yeah. So there was a spike post Christmas that ended around I think around 12 days ago. So that would have been around the 9th or 10th, I think, or something like that. So we're already a couple of weeks into a decline. Pretty much every region is currently seeing a decline in new cases relative to its recent peaks in January. The Midwest has been on a sustained decline since last fall when they had a huge outbreak.
Yeah, that's good news.
So that's good. Every region's seeing a decline. So right now from recent peaks in early January. So the West, the South, and the Northeast all peaked again after Christmas in early January and have been declining since then. So I saw another statistic that was pretty encouraging. It's not enough, but 80% of adults are wearing masks in public.
Oh, great. In every state, or it must vary by state.
I guess that's an average. Yeah. So some states probably more than others. Yeah.
Yeah, there's certain districts here in our state where fewer people wear masks than that, and then there's other ones where more people wear masks. I wear a mask when I'm out, so. Sure.
Yeah, me too. Yep. So maybe, I know that the Biden administration rolled out a plan to try to, support the rollout of the vaccination process. So maybe that will help.
Yeah, he wants to do 100 million vaccines in 100 days. That's ambitious. Hope we can pull that off. So that would be good.
Yeah, I hope that'd be great too. Yeah, we have planned a trip last year to go to the British Isles, go on a cruise in June of this year. Hasn't been canceled yet, but we think between what's going on in the U.S. and England's had one of the worst outbreaks of COVID in the world, that it will be canceled soon. But it hasn't been canceled yet, but we have no hope that we're going on that trip.
Yeah, we had a trip scheduled for Milan and Venice last year in June. And of course, Milan and Venice, for those of you who forgot, those were the first two real big hotspots outside of the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so that trip got canceled, and we have basically the same trip rescheduled 1 year later for this May to the same places. And I guess we'll see if everybody gets caught up in time so we can pull that trip off or not.
Yep.
Interesting too. You've been keeping your eyes and ears on the story itself about the origins of this, as to whether or not it's lab generated or if it was, a
wet
market jungle meat kind of issue there, or what are your thoughts? What are your observations? Because I think the lab is starting to look pretty suspect now.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who forgot, that there's a lab in Wuhan that studies viruses, and that's their centers of excellence there. I think they only have 2 in the whole country, and that's where it broke out. So you can imagine just a couple of lab techs, the doctors,
get infected, or
made a mistake, and here we are, right?
It's possible. It's possible. I mean, the wet markets have helped the spread of other coronaviruses, but yeah, it could be lab generated too. I don't know. I'm not sure what kind of indicates. But given China's secrecy, we'll probably never find out.
Yeah, I don't know we'll ever know the true story there. So that's going to be hard to come by. So
I've heard they're having another outbreak, but so they're planning these mass quarantine camps.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
Quarantining in China sounds like that could be rather draconian too.
Yeah. So. Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, I think I read where Taiwan had gone without a case for a long while, and then some pilot, I think, flew in from Australia. Had you read about that one?
Oh, I haven't read about that. I know Australia has been doing very well lately, and Taiwan has had very few deaths, partly because they very early mitigation, and it's also an island nation, so they're able to isolate better. In the United States, Hawaii's got one of the lowest rates of COVID infections. But they're also almost on complete lockdown, whereas other states are not. So, but as an island nation, but I hadn't heard that there was another case or another outbreak in Taiwan.
Yeah, I think they had a case. I think it was a pilot that flew in that didn't demonstrate it, and then he did, and then they had a few cases. I think they started scrambling, but they had been flat with very few or if any cases for several weeks or months. Then all of a sudden they had that thing hit, and it was kind of was unexpected. They didn't expect that would happen. So
there's been some countries that have done very well. I think it was Rwanda has done extremely well limiting COVID, but they've had a very draconian response. They're tracking people with drones, looking at and fining people and putting people in jail if they violate curfew and not wearing masks, things like that. So it's much more authoritarian government. So that's that can is it worth it? You can ask if it's worth it. But other democracies, Taiwan's a democracy, they were able to control it without taking quite such drastic measures. But my understanding is people in Asia are not as contrary, I guess, as people in the United States are, in terms of, I'm my freedoms and
well, that's part of the American way, I guess, is we came here for freedom, or we're born with it, and we like to flout it. But at a certain point, the reason they call it public health is that there's a public component to it, and you don't wear the mask simply for yourself. You wear it for everybody that's around you. I think that largely in Asia, they seem to understand that far better than we do. And, or at least
the collective good versus the individual. Yeah. I mean, of course, the United States was, except for the indigenous folks that were here, but largely, most of us are descended from folks that came here because of relatively, what you think of now as relatively small disagreements over religion.
Right.
And they were being killed in Europe for them. They came over here, taxes, came over here. One of my first ancestors came over here was a Huguenot, so he was a French Protestant and was persecuted by the church and had to escape with his life.
Oh, geez. Interestingly, we took a trip back to Massachusetts. I went to one of my dad's childhood homes, and the family that lives there invited us in, and we saw the house that my dad grew up in, one of the houses he grew up in, and there's a beam up in the kitchen, and it's carved. I think it read something on the order of 1604 when the house was put up. And so that particular parcel, which was given to a British colonel back in the 1600s or late 1500s, has only been through 7 families since 400
That's crazy.
years. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah. So sometimes you got some longevity there.
So where in Massachusetts is that?
It's in Ashburnham, which is near Fitchburg, Fitchburg's kind of in the middle of the state. It's 50 miles west of Boston, kind of equidistant from the northern and southern edges of it.
Okay.
Yeah. So where did your people come in? What parts of?
Mostly Virginia, from my research on Ancestry.com.
Yeah, my mother, bless her heart, she used to do the family tree. She had traced back. I asked her one day, I said, Mom, how many people you got in the family tree? She's working on the computer. She goes, 17,500 on my side. Yet another 16,000 for my dad's side. So
That's crazy, yeah.
She had traced the family tree. There's a French line to it. So she traced it back to Charlemagne, which of course gets you back to Pepin the Short. So she could trace it back to 400 in one case. So
I think every one in the Western Hemisphere, I think, is or of European descent is a descendant of Charlemagne.
Yes, right.
I think everyone can trace their lineage back to Charlemagne, pretty much.
Well, yeah, I think in the out of Asia, that about half the people can trace their ancestry back to Genghis Khan, right?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Because Genghis Khan fathered a whole bunch of people, and
William the Conqueror. A lot of people can trace their ancestry to William the Conqueror.
And what's interesting too is they talk about you don't want to be inbred, but you at a certain point, because everybody's related to everybody else. My mom traced the family tree back, and she said worked out that her and my father were 17th cousins once removed on one side, 19th cousins twice removed on the other side.
It's funny.
It's astonishing. I mean, how many generations do you have to go back to get to that kind of information? So yeah, that's interesting. So
yeah, I can trace my that ancestor who came from France. I can trace his lineage back several hundred years before that.
Yeah, the most recent people that you would know in our family tree were my dad's middle name was Morse, and so Samuel F.B. was a great uncle. Yeah, so that's the good side of the family tree, and then there's another part of the family, Ms. Lizzie Borden. Maybe you heard of her.
Oh wow, yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's pretty amazing. So Lizzie Borden and Samuel Morse. Well, how about that? That's quite a pair. Yeah. Yes, my granddad's family had done a lot of genealogy research, and they claim we were descended from Francis Scott Key, but I can't figure out how that works.
Oh, okay.
I've not been able to verify that. It could be another one of those urban legends.
Well, yeah, urban family legend, right?
Urban family legend. Yeah, we are descended from. I am descended on my mom's side from George Mason, not the George Mason in Virginia. He was George Mason the fourth, but I'm descended from George Mason the first. It was the first George Mason to come to this country.
Wow, interesting.
First of that lineage. So from his second or third wife. So where's your next class going to be? I'm looking for new opportunities. I don't have anything scheduled yet, but I'm contact some folks and see about trying to generate some more interest. Yeah.
So lately, I know for our listeners, Christian's been following the COVID outbreak very closely, and he's been putting posts up. I've been getting a good deal of my real education about COVID from Christian. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I'm hoping that our listeners will start to wend their way towards your website again. So say again what your website is for the listeners, would you please?
Yes, Christian, just like they're spelled, just like the religion. And then the letter B as in boy and smart, christianbsmart.com.
You'll find most of my postings. I'm putting my stuff up on my LinkedIn website, Douglas Howarth at linkedin.com. I also have a website that I just formed called douglashowarth.com, and we are now in the process of changing our company name from Multidimensional Economic Evaluators, which we do multidimensional economics, but a friend of mine pointed out that was rather long-winded. So they said, well, why don't you take hyper, which means existing in 3 or more dimensions in nomics, and call it that. So that's the new name of the company. We're going to be Hypernomics Inc. from now on. So we're forming that subsidiary of us in Texas here. So we're in the process of forming that right now. But
much lower tax rates in Texas than
yeah,
California.
and we don't have any work here in California to speak of, and we've got employees in Texas, so it made sense for us to migrate that way. So that's the way we're going to go.
Yeah, like Elon Musk, I think he's moving that way too.
Yeah, well, and in fact, one of the things that I talk about in my series there is about how taxes work in the real world, which is to say you want high revenues from taxes. It doesn't follow that you want a high tax rate.
Right.
And so I think I'd like to bring that up next time. Is I'm going to talk about the Laffer curve, which relates the tax percentage to the tax yields, and we're going to talk about a Laffer curve for marijuana. And I've done that before. The new data should be rolling in, and we can get a more fleshed out version of that. So I'm looking forward to the new data coming in.
Now, do you think that in the next 2 years, I know the House has expressed some interest in repealing the federal restrictions on marijuana, but now with the Democrats controlling the Senate and the presidency, you think there'll be some interest in basically making it not a federal crime anymore?
I think there's been interest for a while, and I think that there might be enough to push it over. And I think that the government should do 2 things. Well, 2 or 3 things. They should decriminalize it. Make it legal for right now for people that run those kind of institutions to abide by normal banking laws, because they can't do that right now. That's part of the problem that they have. Mm-hmm. And then they ought to take a real hard. They ought to also. There's a problem in the industry, in that various strains, or what are purportedly the same flower, have very different efficacies across, just one state. For example, you could go to Colorado and pull up something called blank Kush, pick your title, and there might be 8 versions of it. And the efficacy, the CBD concentrations in it could vary from 5% to 25%. I think there needs to be a standard testing lab to test it from the government, just not to try to put a hyper control on it, but to make sure that people know what they're getting. And then that would actually draw more people to the government sales than the black market. The problem the government's had is that if they tax too high, people go to the black market instead of coming to the government. So if the government were to make the testing part of the feature of getting a government issued product, because you know what you're getting, you have fewer.
Because there are some legitimate medical uses for it.
Yes. Yeah. Then the government's going to make more money, and they're going to stop a whole bunch of, really ticky-tack criminal offenses that we don't need to have anymore. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Well, Christian, it's always my great pleasure to talk to you again. Congratulations.
Oh, same here. Thanks. Thanks, Doug.
Looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Smart Remarks, Howard States has been brought to you by Multidimensional Economic Evaluators. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at info@meevaluators.com. For more information on Christian, please visit his website, christianbsmart.com. And for more information on Doug, see his LinkedIn page, Douglas Howarth, or his website, doughowarth.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep reaching for the right answer.